Welcome back to the panel discussion, Running the Numbers, How Data Analytics is Transforming Government Finance, sponsored by EY on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today, Mark Easton, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer at the Defense Department, Tim Gribben, the Chief Financial Officer and Associate Administrator of Performance Management at the Small Business Administration, Dorothy Aronson, the Chief Information Officer at the National Science Foundation, Mike Whitglow, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer at the National Science Foundation, and Sam Hughes, a consulting leader in the U.S. government practice at EY. We started to get into the discussion about the workforce during the last segment. Dorothy, let me bring you into this because a lot of what Tim and Mark and they were talking about workforce goes back to the technology side of it as well, because you got to have the data scientists, you got to have the people with the skill set. So maybe give a sense of the NSF workforce and changes you're seeing.
Well, I like to talk about the entire federal workforce, if you don't mind, because I think that the advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics, sometimes they scare people. Because, and we were talking about how it's going to transform the CFO shop and how much more strategic thinking that those people are going to be doing, but it also has a way of making people feel like their world is changing. And I think that these technologies are going to create new and more jobs, and that jobs that we haven't even imagined yet are going to come into the forefront, and everyone's work is going to change. And I think that we've seen that first, of course, in the CFO shop, because again, they're the leaders in adopting these technologies. But it's very exciting to be involved at this moment in history as all of this change is happening.
You make a really interesting point that it's going to create new jobs. Mike, where do you see those new jobs? Like when we're going to talk about the workforce of the future, but maybe to give me a sense of it's not just, hey, we're going to stop doing this transactional data, but we're going to do what more of?
Well, I think with the workforce and how important it is, let me give you just like a live example of something that just happened last week. I mean, we're working to implement robotic processing automation. So, you know, we have like a workload issue, and you know, there's nothing low value about the work. It's just, you know, how do you keep up with it with the budget and, you know, hiring pressures we have. So we had, I was just so proud last week, we had one of our staff accountants who took a course over the summer on how to program robotic processing automation. So you get the software and then you learn how to implement it, and then, you know, you see it in action. So instead of doing all the, you know, work that goes along with entering transactions, the technology does it for you. So they have more time now to do analytic or, you know, more advanced work.
And the time they took to program that software, yes, on the front end may have been a little longer than maybe you hope, but the next time they have to do it, the next set of transactions, they'll get a little better.
Right.
And you're developing this skill set that in 6 months or 8 months from now, they will be that person who Dorothy's probably going to steal from you.
Right, and I just want to say one thing. I won't steal them. One thing that's really important about this is that the people who know the process are also implementing the solution. And think about how much time that saves in the dropping off of information between IT people and financial people. So that's what I mean when everyone is IT-ish, they're going to have the ability, but they have to be engaged.
Right.
They have to want that change to occur. They're not going to invest their time in learning how to do it.
Sam, are you starting to see that whether it's at EY when you are hiring people, they have that technical background that they can do some software programming, or how are you guys also preparing, I guess, for that same workforce changes?
Absolutely. I mean, I look back to when I joined EY as a young staff consultant many years ago. There was never that expectation that I would come in with any hardcore technology skills. And what we're seeing coming off of campuses today, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level, is that there's really not this distinction anymore of business-oriented people and technology-oriented people. Everyone's coming in with the skills to manipulate large data sets. Everyone's coming in with skills and wanting to practice and learn these new technologies. I think Michael was talking about that, about, you know, we see our consultants in their spare time, they want to learn more about these new technologies and become certified and bring them into practice, because they see that as not only their intellectual interest, but also, you know, broadening their career and giving them more capabilities.
And Mark, from a DoD perspective, you know, when you came in to the government, computers were probably not on everyone's desks yet, and everyone had maybe one phone for the office or something. But you're also seeing that change of the workforce from the soldiers and civilians who are coming in.
Absolutely. I have to be careful. Some of the young people today, when I start to talk about punch cards and those kinds of things, it takes them back a little bit. But the technology has been a game changer for the department. It has positioned us to be able to do things in the Department of Defense that we could have never done before. Very, very important. We're beginning to experiment in the robotics area to be able to make our audit more cost effective. In other words, at least one of our organizations has programmed a robotic application to be able to go and retrieve samples from the auditors. Like Sam's firm is looking, and to be able to make the audit less, more cost effective. The one point that I wanted to make too is that we're trying to, when we talk about things like the audit, it conjures up terms like sort of a compliance-oriented exercise. We're trying to make sure, as we build our repository, enterprise data repository, we make sure that we understand where that data is coming from, and reminding people, for example, inventory. Where we're trying to emphasize stewardship and accountability, that the auditors will be looking at that data every year. And so the audit, that compliance exercise, sort of has an additional value proposition that I think people can identify with. So I think that's a very important relationship as well.
Tim, I'm going to bring you in the conversation as well, because the other hat, one of the other 8 hats you wear, is performance management. And we're talking about, is the workforce ready? Is the data in siloed? Do we have access to it? Is it in the cloud? But really in the end, it comes down to what do we do with the data once we do all these other things? Maybe from a performance perspective, with the CFO's kind of hat on the other side of your head, where does the ability to have the right data at the right time to make the right decision, how's that starting to morph too?
Yeah, so and I alluded to that earlier when we talked about the work that SBA has done with Treasury on developing business use cases, and that's what that's all about. So you have the data. What do you do with it? Well, what do you do with it? There's from a financial perspective, you want to know what's it costing you to deliver your goods and services. So that's part of it, is being able to have a better cost allocation methodology with a business rules that make sense, and the data that you can rely on, the data quality, which is something that's important. And that then from the performance standpoint, being able to tie in, now that you have a way of allocating FTE costs, people costs to programs, and then you have program outcomes that you're measuring. And as we look at what measures and metrics that we're gathering, being able to marry that information together, then from the other hat I have is under program evaluation. So as you have that kind of standardized data that's available to measure the effectiveness of programs from different dimensions, performance, financial, and then you can start making decisions about how should I modify the delivery of my program? What policies might I need to change in order to better deliver to whatever program you have, whoever your constituents are? And that's how it all comes together for me under performance and financial management.
Sam, you brought up the term ROI, and I'm going to steal this, so I'm just going to warn you now. Instead of return on investment, results on investment, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's a great term for government. Is that something that once we get all this data together, then we can start talking what are the results? What are we getting for each dollar spent?
Absolutely, and this is one of the biggest trends which we're seeing on the business side of government agencies today, is this appetite to really understand, if I spend incremental dollars in this area, what will I get for it? How do I know that is the highest and best use of that funding? Particularly within the DoD space, where they're looking at trying to increase readiness across a very wide range of programs, and knowing, should I be directing this towards this level of readiness on this program or that program to achieve the outcomes which I'm looking for. It's a really challenging problem and requires access to a huge amount of data to be able to do that on both the financial and the operational side of the agencies. But that is absolutely what we're seeing with senior leaders in those organizations today.
Tim, jump in.
I just want to jump in. One thing I forgot to mention is the access to information from other agencies has also been key. As an example of that, so when we've been working on some calculations of ROI, and that's by being able to bring in census data so that we know the loans are our counseling education programs. Once we have that population statistics, we can start calculating things that I was never able to calculate before.
Mark, that's the same thing with DoD. That's this return. What are you getting for each dollar? I mean, that's even more critical for DoD because of how much dollars you have, but with the mission you do. How are you guys starting to look at this return?
We're trying to, as I mentioned, in the National Defense Strategy, we focus on performance and accountability. We are trying to use this enterprise data repository to be able to make those kinds of linkages. And so we're looking at use cases to be able to link the readiness for particular weapon systems, as an example, and the investments that go into making those. And as Sam pointed out, because many of those things have been very locally determined, oftentimes subjective. We're trying to use data to be able to answer those kind of questions. But in the past, DoD had tried to implement data standards for standard's sake. Right now, we've identified the what kind of questions do we need to answer. And then, as I mentioned before, the CFO is becoming more and more a holder of a single source of the truth, to be able to talk to the functional people that are in charge of readiness, but say, we're going to try to use this data.
Sam, where does an agency start if they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we measure those results on investment? Is there a good, start small, I get it, don't eat the ocean in one apple bite or something, or don't swallow the elephant in the ocean, I always forget what those terms are, but maybe talk a little about where do you start with trying to understand the results?
Right. Well, they say, if you want a better answer, you've got to ask better questions. And I think that is a big part of the role of the CFO going forward. As we see this huge proliferation of data that's available to individuals today across all these different systems, you can get lost in this sea of data, just asking infinite questions in an infinite sea. And I think the finance organization is really at that point to be able to say, let's define the outcomes we want to see. Let's get confidence that we understand the drivers of those outcomes in a data-informed way. And then as we're looking across our portfolio, that we can pull the right levers backed by financial resources that get to the outcomes that we want. And I think finance is absolutely at the core of that, and it starts with, frankly, defining specifically what are those outcomes and how do I have confidence about the drivers of those outcomes.
Tim.
And how SBA gets that is we published an enterprise learning agenda. Our first one we published last February, and that asks all those key questions that we want answers for. That helps us inform what data that we need and helps us inform what evaluations we're going to perform.
This has been just a fascinating conversation in so many ways. We're just about out of time, but one of the things, and Sam, you opened the door for us, so let's walk in, the sea of data, define the outcomes, ask the good questions. So as the CFO role continues to change, as the agencies continue to look at it as more performance and results oriented, where do you see this discussion continuing to go around the CFO and the role it plays? Let me start with Mike on this one.
One thing I just wanted to add, performance is really important, but I think risk management and enterprise risk management is as well, because you want to use the data to help show that risks and opportunities that you might not have known before. So it's really kind of shifting away from all the compliance, internal control work. The systems and the tools can help you do it, but now we've got the opportunity to help performance make better decisions.
I was really worried. We went almost this whole conversation with no discussion on enterprise risk management.
I had to make a
A123, right? Mm-hmm. What's the section?
Appendix A? Well, there's several sections.
Dorothy, talk about the future as your relationship from a CIO's perspective.
So I've been delighted with our evolving team recently and over the past few years, and I think that that's only going to continue, that NSF is going to continue to have more cross-functional teams and a diversity of skills on those teams. I think the teams will be fluid and the skills will continue to evolve rapidly, and I think we've been pretty good at doing that. Actually, I think we've been excellent at doing that up till now, and we're just going to keep going.
All right, excellent. Sam? Talk a little bit about where you're seeing this all, the CFO role and the interaction with CIOs going.
Well, I just think you're going to see a very, very different type of finance organization here in the near future. And I think you're going to see finance having a bigger role at the table for strategic decision making and strategic risk management and mission outcomes. I think you're going to see a different type of finance professional and greater diversity of skills across the finance profession overall. And I think you're going to see the finance organization really involved in the cause and effect relationships within the organization in terms of allocating funding and driving specific outcomes. So I just think it's a really exciting time to be a finance professional right now with all these changes.
30 years of CFO Act, it's always been exciting. Mark?
Absolutely. Between the audit and the senior leadership commitment to the National Defense Strategy, making sure that we get the best out of every taxpayer dollars, I think is putting us in a position, it'll be a very, very exciting time. We envision this as a CFO of the future where we're the holder of that single source of truth to get a better return on investment for the taxpayer.
All right, Tim, give me about 10 seconds.
I also see us as educating the agency on these topics, as well as being able to do better fraud detection.
Enterprise risk management and fraud, the nice bookend. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Running the Numbers, How Data Analytics is Transforming Government Finance, sponsored by EY on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. Let me thank my guests, Mark Easton, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer at the Defense Department, Tim Gribben, the Chief Financial Officer and Associate Administrator of Performance Management at the Small Business Administration, Dorothy Aronson, the Chief Information Officer at the National Science Foundation, Mike Whitlow, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer at the National Science Foundation, and Sam Hughes, a consulting leader in the U.S. government practice at EY. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search EY Data Analytics.
On behalf of EY, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.